this fourth webinar hosted by the Irish Wildlife Trust and in conjunction with ourselves, the Sustainable Water Network. This is the fourth webinar in a water-specific series that the Irish Wildlife Trust have been running. The first one we did a kind of a basic Water Framework Directive explainer, and then over the last 2 weeks we've been looking at various pressures on our water environment, hydromorphology, and then agriculture and urban wastewater treatment. So it's been done because we are in the run-up. In fact, tomorrow is the deadline for the government consultation on the River Basin Management Plan, and that's the government's plan for how it's going to manage our waters for the next 6 years, up to the final deadline for the Water Framework Directive in 2027. And I guess a sneak preview, many of you may know at this stage, the Irish Wildlife Trust and Swan are not very happy about that, and we've been running a campaign, and we might just say a quick word about that again at the end. So today we're focusing on biodiversity. Obviously, a lot of our most precious habitats and species are in the aquatic and in the wetland environment. And so today we're delighted to have Dr Evelyn Moorkens. Evelyn is a consultant and research associate in Trinity College Dublin and is by far and away our best and most renowned expert on freshwater pearl mussels. And Evelyn is going to tell us about these fascinating creatures. And then after Evelyn, Pádraic has been relieved of his chairing duty so that he can speak to us today about the links between biodiversity and water quality, something about restoration and how water quality links into the wider environmental landscape. So we're going to start with you, Evelyn, and we'll let you share your slides if you have some. Thanks.
Myself. That's better. Now, here we go. So this is the distribution of Margaretifera in Ireland. So if we start with that and then we compare it, as we're talking about the Water Framework Directive with the Water Framework Directive high status objectives, you can see that we're at the very high end of the Water Framework Directive territory here, and there's a bit of an overlap. There's a very apparent overlap between where we find the high status objective waters with the Water Framework Directive and where we have freshwater pearl mussel catchments. When you dig deeper into it, it's not so clever, but we'll get to that later on. So the reason why most of the Water Framework Directive high status objectives are the ones that are closer to higher status coincide with the pearl mussel catchments is because they're really there because they're the same reasons. They're oligotrophic waters on acid soils with a lot of blanket bog and open peat habitats that have been relatively undisturbed until recently. So they've been relatively natural until recently. However, recently things have got much more disturbed in those catchments and much more intensified. So as we know, the Water Framework Directive high status rivers are dropping, and so are the pearl mussel populations. And we have developed extinction curves where we're looking at how long left we are going to have mussels in our rivers, and they range from the best rivers, which we call the top 8, which are likely to be extinct somewhere between 2070 and 2100, and the worst of our rivers in the bottom 8, which are likely to be extinct somewhere between 2040 and 2060. So the reason for the sensitivity of the mussel is largely due to their life cycle. So the adult mussels are buried about 1/3 to 2/3 in the riverbed gravels, as you can see in the picture on the bottom left. They're separate sexes. They have to fertilize each other. And then the mussels brood their larvae among their gills. And when they grow too much and the gills are under stress, they release them as larvae called glochidia. And those glochidia snap onto fish gills, as you can see in the top right picture there. And they, the fish encysts a little capsule around them, and they stay there over the winter. And then the following early summer, the juvenile mussels are released in relatively low flows so that they can drop down into the riverbed and bury for about 5 centimeters. And there they stay until they're at least 5 years old. So the real problem in the life cycle is where those 2 red lines are. It's where the juveniles have to bury in the gravel. And by the time they get to the stage of open water filtering, they're just that bit stronger. So we can look at this almost diagrammatically, that the adult mussels are filter feeding in the open water, whereas the juvenile mussels are 5 centimeters down. They have to take all their nutrients and all their oxygen 5 centimeters buried in the river. And if you think about a salmonid, which buries its eggs in the winter time when the gravels are clean, these juvenile mussels have to withstand the riverbed gravels for at least the first 5 years of their life, 365 days a year. So obviously when you get a bit of sedimentation and it affects the oxygen, the juvenile mussels will either try to crawl up towards the open water, where they are likely to be pulled away by the flow, or else they'll die. And this is what happens. And then as the habitats get poorer and poorer, the adults are progressively killed, as well as the juveniles, because if there's suspended sediment in the open water, then the mussels are filter feeding sediment that has no nutrients in it, and that's what they're trying to feed on, and they'll eventually just either clam up if it's temporary, or if it's chronic, then they'll die. So what leads this problem? The main issue in most of our rivers is the flow, because the flow leads to impairment of the riverbed. And even if you've got perfectly fine sediment and nutrient, it can concentrate it into levels that are just enough to remove the oxygen for juvenile mussels. So really the flow, the things that lead to flow changes like abstraction, land drainage, forestry on peat, any modifications in the river itself, high flows that lead to erosion or over deepening or over widening, and that includes climate change, weather patterns. And then you have that, you know, even if the sediment and nutrient is fine, that can be a problem. But you also have excessive fine sediment through land drainage, bank erosion, overgrazing, and inappropriate land use, such as forestry or agricultural that's put onto drained peat where it shouldn't be. The excessive nutrient, of course, comes from intensification, the same forestry, agriculture, but also on-site wastewater treatments and point source nutrients as catchments intensify. So all of these things are working as multiple stressors on the mussel. So these are the sort of low flow impacts that we get in really good, low nutrient, low sediment rivers through catchment drainage, through forestry on peat, through land reclamation and for agriculture on peat, through peat cutting. So even when there's no nutrient or sediment in excess, you can see that the low flows will kill both juveniles and the adults. If you add nutrients to the low flows, you get worse problems, and sediments and flows is enough to just kill all the juveniles and a lot of adults. And if you add all three of them together, low flow with high sediment and nutrient, then you have just untenable conditions for both adults and juveniles. So flow really is where it all matters, and really in thinking about the Water Framework Directive, there's a lot of concentration on nutrients and sediment, so we really need to talk about flow. This is, the best pearl mussels in Ireland are in the western open peat catchments, not a tree in sight, not an intensive field in sight, no peat cutting. They've very high water tables, and these high water tables lead to decent flows all the way through the summer, and they buffer the really excessive flows in the winter. So the mussels aren't pulled away. They're not killed during the summer, and they're really widespread. They can form beds right across the river. So you can see sort of mussels from one bank to the other. And if you take a quadrat apart to see the age range, the size range, this is the sort of picture you get on the right. This came out of a quarter of a metre squared, and it's got every size range from just a couple of years old right through to old age. And in contrast, the worst populations are restricted to these tiny pockets of habitat where you get a little bit of preferential flow. You've got so much drainage of the land that in the summer, the low flows are just enough to kill every juvenile in the river. And in the winter, all of the water just comes straight down all the drains, and it's really aggressive flows. And if you have any juvenile survival, they'll be pulled into pools and areas where they can't survive. So really the last of the adults are in these sort of bends or edges of islands where there's a bit of preferential flow in the summer, and they're protected from high flows in the winter. So this is the sort of area we'd be talking about, where maybe half the river would dry up, or there might be an island, so you get a little bit of preferential flow down one area of the river. And this is due to extensive land drainage. Again, it doesn't have to be a lot of sediment and nutrient, it's just the drainage that does this. So that's the difference that we get in the best quarter of a metre squared quadrat in these good rivers on the left and poor rivers on the right. So this loss of juveniles, it can happen. It's particularly bad if you have this sort of edge sedimentation. The mussels are trying to come out, but the flow is too low. You've got a bit of nutrient, a bit of algal growth, or myriophyllum are taking hold. These river weeds are taking hold in the sediment, and it's just a very bad situation for them all. So what sort of rehabilitation can you do? Well, the best thing really is to try and, first of all, save the best habitats. And the Pearl Mussel Project is doing a great job in scoring the landowner's land. And the wetter the indicator species get, the more they get paid. And they also help in drain blocking and peaty areas. And that's exactly what we need to protect the flows. And in conjunction with protecting the flows, it's also storing more carbon, which is very good for our climate actions as well. So all of these things together are doing a fabulous job. So this wetness level that you get in the fields is really important. We've got to the stage where we do need to start to pay for water function, for water quality function, and part of that is to pay for this level of wetness and seepage, because not only does that protect the flows of the river, but it also feeds the mussels. Where you have a lot of mussels in the river, they need these oligotrophic nutrients coming from these oligotrophic areas that are just right to feed the juveniles. And as they travel down the wetland, they form little pools and flushes and end up in the river. And wherever we get these little lovely pools of flushes, we tend to get nice juveniles nearby. So to sum that up, really, a good population has really good flows, very little drainage. You might have a couple of tributaries. Best ones have a lake at the top. So when you look at mussels spread out all through the river, you've got juveniles, you've got adults, so that's a good population. majority of the young salmonids that are in those rivers are going to get encysted with Glaucidia. Excuse me, that's my phone. So the chances, because all the fish are encysted with young mussels, the chances of the juveniles dropping off in the right place are very high. But in this bad population where you only have a few adult mussels left at the bends, the chances of fish getting encysted are much lower. And these smaller numbers of fish with the larvae on their gills are much less likely to drop them off in good areas. And even when they do, it's very hard for them to survive. So a good population can turn into a bad population very quickly. So we do have, in spite of all these problems, we do have some of the best populations in the world for this species, because they are doing even worse in other countries. We've had 26 years of the Habitats Directive and 22 years of the Water Framework Directive, and the decline is still continuing. So we haven't got to grips with it yet because of their extreme level of sensitivity and this very obvious impact when it happens. So out of these 92 populations that are left in Ireland, 27 of them have been made into Natura 2000 sites in 19 SACs. And these all need restoration. So they don't have a maintain objective, they have a restore objective. So out of these, we have 80% of mussels in the top 8 catchments. And we really need to totally restore these to natural levels, because the mussels are currently right across the river. And before long, they will start to get very restricted, like the worst populations. And they are the most isolated locations. And until recently, really until the trees became mature and a lot more land got reclaimed and machines were used for turf cutting, things were manageable, but now they're not. So we have planning issues, we have agricultural issues, and we have forestry issues. And to counteract that, in 2009, the 2009 freshwater pearl mussel regulations were brought in. And these were to write sub-basin plans, which could fit in under the river basin district plans. And they were to be law by December 2009. And they had fines and imprisonments and reviews to be had every 6 years. So we should have had 1 published plan and 2 published reviews in the same sort of way that we have the river basin plans. I have these in red because they have never been published. So Ireland is actually in breach of its own regulations, and because we don't have plans with measures to help these rivers, they can't go into the river basin plans, so they can't be acted on by the river basin plans. So we have these continued catchment issues, such as land reclamation, where peat that normally absorbs water is being improved and dried and drained. We have forestry issues where we have large swathes of forestry that's reaching maturity, which is also intercepting land that should be going into bog. It's evapotranspiring at times of the year where we desperately need the water to fall onto the catchment. And these become river issues. So we get low flows, and as the banks will dry out in the summer. Of course, in the winter, we get much higher flows because it's running down all the drains, and then we get bank erosion. And that ends up with a table full of dead mussels, which we regularly end up collecting from rivers. So our strategies that we would like to deal with the pearl mussels can appear contradictory, but they're not really. In the top 8, we really want to remove trees, block drains, and restore saturated open peat. And the same with the agricultural land, try to block the drains and restore this catchment hydrological function. It's not so much the problems in the river, the problems are in the catchment. The hydrology has to be fixed in the catchment rather than in the river. But in the bottom 8, we want to do the opposite. We want to take trees away from the top 8. We want to plant them in the bottom 8 because we have intensive farming, and we know that the drainage can't be changed. It's at that level of intensification that it can't be restored. So what we need to do is manage the nutrient and sediment, but none of that can happen without captive breeding, because in those bad rivers, we will never get to the flows that are needed to maintain the juveniles naturally. We're in a conservation dependent catchments at that stage. So with captive breeding, we could plant trees, but where we have very large numbers of mussels, we desperately need to take away trees. So as I said to you at the beginning, the Water Framework High Status Objective appears to be working for mussels as well, but it's actually the mussel rivers themselves with the mussels in it that need to be very high status are not in the high status objectives. So these are, for example, our 4 Donegal SACs for mussels, and as you can see that none of the habitat for mussels has a high status objective. And if you look at the levels of mussels and the Q values that go with it, there's it's not really you can see that they're slightly worse in the imminent extinction and slightly better in the unfavorable poor. Bad, but really taking Q values at riffles are not quantifying the flow pressures in the mussel habitat. They're not answering the question that we need answered. So I just finished with just directed on the Water Framework Directive and where I think the problems are. The Water Framework Directive follows the 2009 regulations, but all 139 populations in the 97 rivers in Ireland that have mussels need high status, and there's actually an international SEN standard saying that. So there's a lot more high status rivers needed in Ireland. In the Water Framework Directive, high status is Q4 or Q4 to 5 or Q5, but marked river populations need at least Q5. If there was a Q6, they'd need them. The Q values are taken at the riffles for the Water Framework Directive, but Q5 is needed in runs where mussels live in the slower flow. The water chemistry is generally based on mean values, whereas mussel kills and juvenile kills are episodic. They can be over very, very short times, just a few days in places. And in the Water Framework Directive, the hydrological function is mainly considered at the rivers. It's looking at hydraulics and blockages and dams and things, whereas hydrological function for mussels is a catchment issue. It's all about catchment drainage. And these low flows are killing juveniles again over very short times, which we don't really measure at all. And so dealing with mussels in the Water Framework Directive is really reliant on conservation projects like the Pearl Mussel Project, which is mentioned in the new River Basin draft, and projects such as the Blue Dot scheme. But these conservation projects are voluntary, and the Blue Dot, it does a lot of investigations, but it can't really do anything. It doesn't have power to do things itself. So let's look at some better approaches before I finished. The SEN approach is to have restoration measures and keep going with them until it's sustainable for non-SAC populations, populations, but for this doesn't enter into the River Basin Plan. The SEN standard isn't mentioned. All populations of mussels need Q5 or Q6 if we make that up. So the measures that need to be taken have to be site specific, that will improve where the mussels are, not just the riffles. For that, we monitor with things like redox potential and flow velocities, and we measure their improvements through demography. So these measurements that are taken by Parks and Wildlife need to be brought into the Water Framework Directive So these episodic kills need to be monitored using continuous on measurements, where we can use them for things like flow and turbidity, so that we get an idea of how, are things getting better, are things getting worse. And the hydrological function being a catchment issue, well, we use remote sensing to set targets for and monitoring progress for mussel catchments, and this should be brought into the Water Framework Directive. These conservation projects that are voluntary and the blue dot investigations need to be improved into wider cap schemes that are less voluntary and climate-driven incentives. You know, there's a lot of companies that are just looking for projects to sequester carbon, and open peat is an ideal way to do that. If we had per mussel plans published, it wouldn't be voluntary, it would be a requirement. So time is running out. This is the most recent extinction curve that I've made for what could arguably be our best river, the Owen River in Connemara. In 2010, we had 2 million mussels in the river, and we put in a best case scenario and a worst case scenario extinction curve in the draft sub-basin plans. So we thought that by 2020, if you see the vertical line, we thought by 2020 we'd have somewhere between 1.5 million and 1.8 million, and we thought that was going to be a terrible loss. Our latest estimate is actually 430,000. So we've lost 75% of mussels in 10 years. So if I can tell you to, ask you to go away with something, I would ask you to ask Minister Noonan, because he's in charge, to update and legally publish the sub-basin plans so that they can be incorporated into Water Framework Directive. And we desperately need a captive breeding facility for the eastern populations, because they're the ones we can't fix through catchment recovery. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Evelyn. It was absolutely fascinating. I had no idea that the mussels relied so much on hydrology. I'd always worried more about the nutrients and the sediments. Could I just ask what happened? Do you know what happened to those sub-basin catchment plans? And if they were implemented in the morning, do you think they would be enough to save our populations, especially those in the southeast, which seem to be especially doomed?
They weren't approved of by the various local authorities and forest services and agricultural departments that really needed to back them. At the time, it was Minister Gormley was in charge. He desperately wanted to sign them off, but he didn't get the backing to. So now we have Minister Noonan, who purports to have a great interest in biodiversity, but I'm not seeing any push to get those. I mean, we had a court case not so long ago when the Munster Blackwater was attempted to be removed as an SAC, but the court case was lost on the fact that there was no legal plan, which was supposed to be in place for the few years. So we're going to find that now, one after another, there's going to be legal cases, and they will all fall, because how can you even pass an appropriate assessment when you're not even trying to publish the plans that legally you said you would by 2009. But the plans are out of date. They need to be updated. They need to be updated, particularly for catchment hydrology, and then they need to be implemented. If they were implemented, then there would be a much clearer means towards appropriate assessment of both plans and projects. Whereas now, I think there is almost a consultant approach which says, oh, put in a silt trap, or as long as there's no sediment or nutrient, it could be okay. No, it's not. We have to restore them. We desperately have to restore them.
And
sorry, that's a rant.
No, it's great to get your insights. And what about the populations in the southeast? Is there any hope for them?
Yes, there is, but we have really unique genetic conservation units there. We have the Nor, which, okay, it may not be a separate species, but it's got the most unusual genetics of any pearl mussel population in the world.
Wow.
And we're now down to about 300 mussels. We have to captive breed it. We lose that genetics, we'll lose that uniqueness. We've maybe a couple of thousand left in some of our best southeast rivers, but you know, they're so intensively drained that, you know, we just need to take actions almost at the point at where it reaches the river, knowing that we can't fix the hydrology, but we can do something to, you know, just that's that juvenile level that's going. We would just have to captive breed, and captive breed if they're about 10 years old. And then we can put them back in the river, maintain them. And that's what they have to do across Central Europe. And across Central Europe, all populations are maintained by captive breeding.
Great.
So, you know, we have to do the same.
Thanks, Evelyn. There's some more questions, and I think maybe we'll hold on to them for at the end, because we need to move on to Pádraic. Pádraic would be no stranger to anybody here, renowned author, podcaster, and also campaign officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. So handing over to you, Pádraic.
Thanks very much, Sinead. Thank you very much, Evelyn, for that great presentation. It is fascinating and devastating in equal measure, I think, when we talk about the freshwater pearl mussel. Now, I'm just going to try and get my slides up. Very good. Right, so I was going to talk to you about the biodiversity aspect of this, and I thought it was fantastic really to hear from Evelyn the introduction there about the freshwater pearl mussels, because the story of the pearl mussel really encapsulates an awful lot of the problems that we face for biodiversity in Ireland. You'll see them at the bottom of this picture. The artist Jacek Maciak, who drew this up for me. You know, we tried to build up a landscape in Ireland that had the pearl mussels in it, and the fish that the pearl mussels rely on, and the rivers flowing in the way that they should be flowing, and the people living in the landscapes and working in the landscapes that also rely on the land. And I suppose what this tells us is that the challenge for the pearl mussels is not just for the pearl mussels. I've often believed that restoring the pearl mussel populations is the biggest conservation challenge that we face, because as Evelyn has pointed out, they really do suffer from every form of land abuse that we have meted out upon them, not only the land drainage and the septic tanks and the wastewater treatment plants and the forestry and the turf cutting and all the things that we've spoken about in previous webinars in this series. But I also feel that it was very encouraging to hear Evelyn at the end of it saying that, look, these populations can be saved. I think one of the great things they have in their favor is that they live so long, and they do reproduce so readily. So if the conditions were right for them, and we were to do the captive breeding program, then I do think the future is bright. But I mean, it's disheartening also to hear about how the regulations and the plans that were drawn up just never really were passed or implemented. And even sure, we know from the previous discussions in this series that even where we have had plans and laws that were passed and approved, they have largely gone unimplemented. But also, I mean, I wanted to kind of emphasize that a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about as part of this Water Framework Directive series and about pollution and drainage, it's not without consequence. It's not just a series of graphs and targets to be met. This is about the integrity of our national ecosystem. And it's not only the freshwater pearl mussel that suffers dreadfully from our neglect of our waterways. And this is an extract from the new, the draft River Basin Management Plan that is open for consultation at the moment. And in it, it states that 88% or 385 of the 439 special areas of conservation have water-dependent habitats or species, and 90% of the special protection areas, which are for birds, have water-dependent bird species. So it's absolutely phenomenal. Our biodiversity depends intricately on having good status of our water bodies and healthy natural ecosystems. And of course, the deterioration of those means that it's not only the pearl mussel, but also the salmon that you see in this picture is threatened with extinction. A number of our aquatic invertebrates are threatened with extinction. The freshwater crayfish, which is a little lobster-like creature, is deteriorating due to the spread of plague. And a number of our bird species are also, and in particular, the wetland bird species along our coastal areas, which we haven't maybe talked about so much as part of this series, but the coastal area is a part of the Water Framework Directive, and the targets apply to the coastal area as well. And 2 years ago, Birdwatch Ireland, in a study they came out with, showed that our wetland wading birds have fallen by 15% in population in just 10 years, up to 2015. So these, when you put all these together, these are cataclysmic declines in biodiversity and the populations of individual species. And this is the map from the draft river basin management plan that shows you the water bodies that are at risk. So this is not the same as the map that shows you the status of water bodies. It's basically looking into the future and saying, you know, what are the chances of these water bodies achieving good status? And I mean, the map just says it all. I mean, it's absolutely devastating. It's incredible to think that we've had 20 years of the Water Framework Directive, and this is what we're looking at. So the challenge ahead is absolutely enormous. And of course, it affects people just as much as it does our biodiversity. But the things I'm talking about are really are going to be around biodiversity. And the Water Framework Directive is one plan, or at least the River Basin Management Plan is one plan. But we've seen that it is intimately connected to our other land use challenges, biodiversity, and also climate change as well. And one of the slides that Evelyn showed in her presentation around the restoration of peatlands really demonstrates, I think, just how important climate action on land use is for water quality and for our biodiversity. So we really need to be looking at these as the same problem. And really it points to why it's such a difficult problem, because we have looked at these in isolation. If you look at the special areas of conservation that we have for rivers, the boundaries just follow the rivers primarily, and the river corridor. But of course, the river can't be in good status without the flow patterns and the water quality that leads into them. So it basically requires action throughout the catchment of those rivers. And when you look at this map and you look at the map of our special areas of conservation that are water dependent, it really requires landscape level action across all sectors of society that use the land. And we've seen already in this series that is principally agriculture, but it is also forestry, and it is also peatlands. Now, I'm going to talk about maybe some of the initiatives that are underway to address this that I think are worth knowing about and worth bringing into this discussion. And foremost among these is the what's called COP15. So the overarching treaty for biodiversity protection in the world is the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD. And every 2 years, they hold conferences of the people or the parties that have signed up to that convention, and they're called COPs. And so we have COPs for climate, and we had COP26 in Glasgow last year. And we were supposed to have COP15 in 2020 until the pandemic arrived. And COP15 was touted as being a magic moment for the fight against extinction. Of course, that didn't really happen, but the discussions around this COP are currently underway in Geneva this week, actually, and are supposed to culminate finally at the end of this year in China. Now, whether that happens or not, we still don't know. It's been postponed so often, but it will provide us with an overarching framework, pretty much like the Paris Agreement, for the restoration and recovery of biodiversity throughout the world. Now, interestingly, a lot of the targets that we think are going to be in this, what's called the framework for biodiversity, have already been taken up by the European Union in the biodiversity strategy. And I've shown an extract from that strategy on the screen here on the left, which is relevant to our discussion today. And it talks about how greater efforts are needed to restore freshwater ecosystems and the natural function of rivers. And it contains a target to restore at least 25,000 kilometers of rivers to make them free flowing by 2030. And that is to be backed up by a restoration law from the European Union, which was supposed to have been published last week. But of course, the people who campaign against all these things have used the war in Ukraine as another obstacle to progress. And so we see that really it's important for everybody to know that there's major forces lined against any of this kind of action that we have to overcome if we are to see these things happening. But I think the general direction of movement is important and is certainly moving in the right direction. Whether it moves at the right speed is a different matter. But it's very encouraging to see that they have incorporated this restoration in the biodiversity strategy. And this has made it somewhat into our draft river basin management plan. And within our plan, we have a proposal, and I'm reading this now, to establish a long-term restoration program to mitigate the negative impact of past construction and activities in or near water bodies. So we're looking at the restoration there of floodplains, of the flow regimes in rivers. Now, that is a huge challenge. As Evelyn pointed out, this is not just about the river, it's about the flow patterns that enter the river. So it's all the land drains in the catchment as well. But that will tie in with our climate action plan, which seeks to restore and re-wet peatlands, particularly agricultural peatlands. And so all of these things will hopefully lead towards that target of restoring rivers. We also see that there's an action pilot project to be undertaken at the Anacotty Weir. Now, those of you who spend a lot of time on social media might recall that Will O'Connor from EcoFact launched a petition to remove the weir at Anacotty because it is such a problem for migratory fish, particularly lampreys and eels that get trapped at this weir and get eaten. And so there is a commitment there to look at that weir. There's also a commitment to develop a roadmap of actions to improve fish mitigation on the lower River Shannon. Now, this is very significant because the Ardnacrusha Dam is our largest dam on our largest river. And of course, since it has gone up in the 1920s, the populations of migratory fish in that river have basically collapsed. And so this would really be a fantastic initiative to open up the River Shannon again to these fish. And so we also see in the draft river basin management plan, there is a minimum target of 2,500 kilometers of riverside interception to be installed. Now, what I mean by riverside interception is trees, basically, or it could be restoration of wetlands or wet forests and so on. And that that figure has been calculated, I think, based on interrupting pathways of phosphate in order to establish riparian zones. People will know when they look at rivers in Ireland that they have very little riverside vegetation. And so the functioning of the river is not just the shape of it or the water quality, but it depends heavily upon the bankside vegetation, which, as we saw earlier, moderates the flows leading into the river, but also is a part of the food chain, the way that nutrients are cycled. And also the way that rivers can, the trees can fall into rivers and change the shape of the rivers. These are very, very dynamic ecosystems. And so that's whether 2,500 kilometers is sufficient or not remains to be seen, but it is certainly something that we would welcome. We also see in our draft river basin management plan a commitment for the removal and modification of up to, well, the range here is quite big. It says between 2,000 and 7,000 structures, dams or weirs or other blockages out of what the Inland Fisheries Ireland have calculated that there are 73,000 of these blockages or dams on our rivers, and they aim to remove 2,000 to 7,000 of them. Now, that could be a very disproportionate or it could have a disproportionate effect because one blockage at the lower end of a river can obviously affect the entire river system. So removing numbers of those dams and weirs at the lower end of the system can drastically improve or expand the habitat for migratory fish. Now, we don't see in our draft river basin management plan a commitment to reform the Arterial Drainage Act. And followers of the Irish Wildlife Trust will know that last year we opened a petition to reform the Arterial Drainage Act. And we delivered that to the minister in charge, Pádraic O'Donovan, who is the minister for the Office of Public Works. And we believe that to be a major impediment to even just stopping the destruction of our river systems at the moment. But we need to be looking ahead and looking at a law that will transform how we deal with rivers and basically turn agencies like the OPW from rivers destroyers into river restorers, and to use their knowledge and information to reverse a lot of the damage that has been done. Now, there is a commitment in the River Basin Management Plan to look at all the legislation behind how rivers are dealt with, and they talk about bringing in a licensing system for things like arterial drainage, which we would welcome as well. There's a lot to be done on the administrative side and making sure that even the actions that are done in compliance with the law. But we really need to see that moved on, because I just think that reforming legislation can take a lot of time, and and we don't have a lot of time. Now, in the minutes I have left, I'm going to just briefly run through some of the other major policy initiatives or reviews that are underway that could help us to get to good status of our water bodies and complement the aims of the Water Framework Directive. Now, I'll start at the top middle, where we have our new National Biodiversity Action Plan. You'll see that that is out. It's not out for public consultation just yet, but that is the fourth National Biodiversity Action Plan that we're going to see. And if we're to have any faith in these plans, we really need to, ask ourselves, why have plans number 1, 2, and 3 not succeeded? And what is going to be fundamentally different about this Biodiversity Action Plan? One of the things we hope will happen is that it will be put on a legal footing. And so the biodiversity plan would be on the same par as our climate action plan and would have proper governance structures and accountability for implementing the measures in it. To do with forestry, we have a project, Woodland, as it's known, is reviewing all aspects of forests and forestry in Ireland. And what we will end up is, as it says in the headline there, not a new forestry strategy, but a new forest strategy, because we urgently need to restore our native woodlands. and that includes riparian woodlands. And there will be public consultation on that as well. There is currently a questionnaire that's open for people to have their attitude on trees in Ireland. In the middle there, you'll see we have a citizens' assembly on biodiversity laws. That's starting next month. The first hearing will happen, I think, in about 2 weeks, and will go on for this year. And it's a chance for everybody really to get involved in this national project for restoring our natural heritage. Bord na Móna, which is another government agency that has been responsible for the industrial mining of our peatlands, they are undertaking quite significant peatland restoration in the Midlands. That won't help our pearl mussels because they're mostly in the River Shannon. But it's the kind of action that we need to see an awful lot more of. We need to be restoring all of our peatlands everywhere. But it is a positive thing that is underway at the moment. To the left here, you at the top, I've already mentioned the Arterial Drainage Act, but in the top left-hand corner, you'll see the real elephant in the room. And this is our agri-food strategy of 2030. Now, it claims that it's going to make Ireland a world leader in sustainable food production, but really that is not what it's going to do. It is really a plan for business as usual. And we have to address this plan head on. And this is directly relevant to our efforts under the Water Framework Directive, because agriculture, because it is such an enormous land area, has a particularly outsized influence on everything to do with land use, and that includes our water quality and our biodiversity and carbon emissions as well. So we really need to get this right. And what we have been urging in the Irish Wildlife Trust is that even though this agri-food strategy, it's not draft anymore, actually, it was published last year, is only 1 year old, it needs to go in the bin. And I think the war in Ukraine and the talk about food security has only highlighted the fact that our food system is inherently unsustainable, and we have to change that. So there's a lot of work there to be done around getting the right agriculture system in place. And over on the right-hand side, lastly, an area that we haven't spoken about a huge amount in our discussions on the Water Framework Directive, but which does fall under the remit, and that is our coastal area and our coastal marine area. And last year we had a public consultation on marine protected areas. We have a commitment by the government to expand marine protected areas to 30% of our seas by 2030. The current figure is about 2.1%. So a lot to be done there. And we see that fishing, which has a direct impact on our coastal zone, particularly aquaculture, dredging and drainage, the use of bottom trawls and so forth in our coastal zone deteriorates the structure, the habitat structure in those areas. That ties it in. We have a marine strategy framework directive as well, which is also related to these issues. And of course, all of the runoff, all the pollution that leaves our land ends up in our estuaries. And as we saw last week, a significant proportion of our estuaries are failing to reach good status. And that has knock-on impacts, of course, for all the wildlife that use our estuaries. So just to wrap up, I think to summarize really our water challenge, it really is a land use challenge, and it is a sea use challenge as well. And it's awfully disheartening to hear about the extinction curve of the freshwater pearl mussels. But we also know that a lot of the solutions are at hand. We know people like Evelyn have been working for a long time on this, and we have many other fantastic experts in our country that have been dealing with these issues. So we do know what needs to be done, but you can see from the array of policies in front of you there that we're still really, really struggling to get that policy coherence. In other words, that one policy is not working against the other policies, so that we're all kind of striving to move things in the same direction. And that really is, I think, at the core of our challenge for climate and biodiversity, and particularly for the Water Framework Directive. Thanks very much. Back to you, Sinead.
thanks, Pádraic. You might unshare there unless you want us to yeah, thanks a million. And thanks, Evelyn, as well. Yeah, Pádraic, just a quick specific question for you. Just talking about the restoration of river channels, and in the River Basin Management Plan, there's quite a specific focus on longitudinal connectivity, so taking out the barriers. To what extent do you think we need to look more at the lateral connectivity, so connecting the rivers with its floodplains and its riparian areas?
I think that is equally important. I think it needs to be done in tandem, and we need to be looking at these in a much more comprehensive way. I mean, we know the projected increase in extreme weather events means that, you know, we're going to be facing flooding issues in towns and cities. That needs to be addressed. We need to be paying, as Evelyn said, we need to be paying farmers for ecosystem service. That has to involve restoring floodplains and making and using land to store water so that it's not you know, washing into people's houses. But we also need to do it in a very sensitive way. So one of the things that we have been trying to promote is to, and I know there's work being done on land use planning, and I know this is something Swan has mentioned as well, is that we have catchment level land use plans to look at what are the biodiversity objectives in this catchment, what are the climate objectives, what are the farming, what are the social objectives in this landscape. So to get the EPA, to get the Department of Agriculture and Teagasc and the National Parks and Wildlife Service into a room with the map in front of them and say, you know, what are the things that are allowed in this catchment, whether it's native forestry or commercial forestry or dairy farming, how much of each of these economic activities can we have? What are the restoration measures that we need to see just to meet minimum legal requirements, whether that's restoring freshwater pearl mussels or whatever it happens to be, and to work backwards to give communities and landowners a framework to work in, because we do also have to acknowledge that a lot of the things we're talking about affect incomes for farmers and affect communities in these areas, and we have to bring them on board if we're to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, thanks, Pádraic. Evelyn, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You have to kind of look at things economically, because, you know, if you have, you can't expect any landowner to reduce their money. So you have to put a value on things. But I do think there's huge opportunity with the climate bill to get some money for carbon sequestration and put that into restoring a lot of our carbon storage, to stop it from losing even more than we have so far, and then also trying to, where we can, restore carbon growth. Now, it's not necessarily, we can't restore pristine bogs on all of our damaged catchments. We can't think that we can make everything perfect, but we can stop the loss of carbon, and that is worth money. And it's much better to pay for ecosystem services flooding upper catchments, because that makes sure that you're not getting those very bad floods in the winter, so you're not getting bank erosion, the farmers aren't losing more land, and it's land that can be paid for that's flooding rather than houses. Mm-hmm. So it makes perfect sense to have natural solutions in the upper catchments.
Yeah, I think the theme that came from both of your presentations was the catchment-based approach that's needed. So this is maybe an unfair question, but if you could wave a magic wand and you could get one thing into the River Basin Management Plan, what would it be? If you couldn't get your sub-catchment plans in, Evelyn.
I'd like to see them more pushing in the requirement for policy change. Because I think the easy option is to say, oh, you know, we'll do something at the drain level and we'll pay farmers at that. That's not what we need. We need a change in policy. We need to have catchments that are going to be looked at as catchments, and we need to be delivering our information on the catchment level and not making us tear our hair out trying to see, well, which catchment is that in? you know, the technology is there so that we should be able to look at data in a catchment way or in a, you know, 10 kilometre square way anyway, as long as that information is presented or maintained that way. So I'd like the data maintained well, and I'd like a catchment policy approach.
Okay. Pádraic, what about you in the last minute?
I would love to see the reform of the Arterial Drainage Act. I think it is by far the single most damaging piece of legislation we have on the books, and it makes sense to very few people. And I think it's an easy win, actually, to reform the act. Getting farmers on board to restoring floodplains would be a harder thing to do, but I think the means of doing it, and we saw about the EIP on the freshwater pearl mussel, I think farmers are open to it when they're being approached in a reasonable way and they're being properly rewarded for it. So I don't think that is insurmountable, but the legislation that requires us to go in and destroy 10,000 kilometers of rivers on a continual basis just is bonkers in this day and age.
Yeah, that sounds. Yeah.
Can I just say that there isn't an entitlement if it's a protected river, even though there might be a perception that the Arterial Drainage Act trumps the Habitats Directive. It does not, and it doesn't even trump it outside the Habitats Directive, because the Environmental Liability Directive is the directive that has not been used to the extent that it should. You might feel entitled to go in and arterially drain, but if you do damage, you have to repair it and you have to compensate for it under the Environmental Liability Directive. So let's change the law, but while we do have the law, let's do it legally.
Excellent.
Yes, and just as a footnote to that, you're absolutely right, Evelyn, but we also see that the law is not being applied and the law is not being adhered to, and when the law is not adhered to, the consequences are not there for the perpetrators.
Folks, I'm watching the clock. It's 2:01, but I can't go without reminding everybody that tomorrow is the deadline for the River Basin Management Plan. Please make a submission, and my colleague Anton has put the link into the action page on Swan's website, which makes it very, very easy. I know I'm going off now to amend the Swan one to put in an extra piece about the freshwater pearl mussel. Evelyn, thank you very much for that. Thanks to everybody. And Pádraic, do you have a last word about the next seminar series from the Irish Wildlife Trust?
Yes, next Wednesday we'll be holding a webinar with our friends in Farming for Nature. So we'll be meeting a number of farmers that are already doing some of the things that we've been talking about today. So I think that will be very interesting. So that's next Wednesday evening.
Excellent. And thank you so much, Pádraic and Evelyn, for two really interesting presentations. And bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.